On the phone, I'd like to welcome to the program Mohammad Khan. He is the Senior Policy Associate with the Washington Park Project. Welcome to the program, Mohammad.
Thanks, Sam.
Mohammad, give it just briefly, what is the Washington Park Project?
Sure. So the Washington Park Project is kind of an organization that grew out of the Zephyr Teach Out campaign for New York State Governor this past summer. It's kind of a project that she wants to initiate to have a public policy organization that's focused on some of the themes that came up during the campaign. So fighting legal corruption, challenging corporate power, and kind of developing a populist vision for New York.
And, one of the things that last week we spoke to Christian Burris, who has written a very incredibly extensive book on what has happened to the New Orleans school system in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And when you contrast that with New York State, or compare it, or either way, it is fascinating to see that in many respects, that we are seeing the same game plan. Of course, in New Orleans, it was about disaster, sort of a shock doctrine treatment of the school system. But in this state, it is a little bit, slightly more subtle. Let's start with the notion of why would Wall Street hedge funders be so interested in taking over essentially the education policy of New York State?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I listened to that interview with Kristen Burris last week, and it was really interesting. And I think we did kind of see the same shock doctrine applied in New York in these state senate elections this past fall. So this group that we highlighted in the report, New Yorkers for Balanced Albany, they kind of just came together like really quickly 7 weeks before the election. They seeded this group with $4.5 million in capital, and then they spent that money very targeted in just a few state senate races across the state, kind of overwhelming these districts with like tons of TV ads and mailers and outside spending that in a lot of cases was a lot bigger and eclipsed the spending that the campaigns themselves were doing. And as far as their actual motives, it's really hard to tell, and I think that's one of the things that's the most troubling about this, is if you look at the ads that they put out, the ads don't mention anything about their actual policy positions. All they do is rely on this fear-mongering of, a liberal takeover of New York State spearheaded by Bill de Blasio. They don't mention anything about their agenda with charter schools, so we really have no way of knowing exactly what their motives are or what their policy ideas are for New York State, because that's something that they never disclosed.
And how do we know? I mean, how do we know that their agenda is exclusively charter reform, or do we not know that? And charter reform, education reform. I put that in quotes because it's obviously it's difficult to sort of accredit them with a real desire to reform education. I mean, I guess they do have a desire to reform it. It's just I don't think that we would like the shape that they want to form it into. So how do we know that even their education stuff is not just simply a Trojan horse for some other policies?
Right. I mean, there's no way of knowing that. We do know that they spent more money in the earlier part of the year on kind of a PR campaign for a charter school group. So that gives us some idea of what their policy vision is. But again, there's no way to tell because there hasn't been they haven't been held accountable to have a public debate or even a public explanation of what exactly their vision for New York State is and what specifically their vision for the New York State education system is.
All right. Well, so give us a sense. I mean, who is Families for Excellent Schools? That sounds like I don't know anybody who doesn't like families or excellent schools. Sign me up. Who is that, and how much money did they have in 2014?
Sorry, so it's Families for Excellent Schools?
Yes.
So that was a lobbying group that was put together at the beginning of the year, and again, it was done in a very opaque manner. They haven't really disclosed who their donors are or what money they spent on lobbying But we do know that some of the people who are publicly associated with that campaign, like Paul Tudor Jones, Dan Loeb, these are the same people that contributed to this PAC, New Yorkers for Balanced Albany, which spent $4.5 million on the state senate races in New York.
And I noticed Dan Senor was in the Balanced Albany, and if I'm not mistaken, Dan Senor, and I think everybody will remember his name from back during the Iraq War days. But if I'm not mistaken, he's married to Campbell Brown, who has been very aggressive in this tenure teacher suit in New York State.
That's correct, yeah.
And so we have these literally millions upon millions of dollars being funneled into the New York State elections in the final days and weeks before the elections. And so what is the agenda here? We know that Governor Cuomo came out and said something which was stunning to me about public schools. Tell us about the privatization agenda.
Sure. So like you mentioned, Andrew Cuomo during most of his first term was pretty silent on the issue of charters, and then you saw the past couple of years a big attempt at lobbying, a lot of money poured into his campaign coffers from charter school supporters, and then you hear him making these comments just a few days before the election about breaking up the public monopoly of schools. And if you go to another governor, Jeb Bush in Florida, you'll see that he made almost exactly the same remarks back in, I believe it was March of this year. So you can kind of see how those two agendas are coinciding.
I want to belabor this point. The idea that public schools are monopolies is one of the most absurd constructions. I mean, it is so patently offensive. It is not. I mean, the idea that public schools are monopolies is absurd. There are other schools out there. The idea that we have an obligation to fund private schools in this state or this country is just absurd. But they use the trust busting language because that resonates. And, of course, they say this in the final days of the campaign so that looking back on the campaign, they can say, I campaigned on this. So there's a mandate here. And so, I mean, talk about what that involves, lifting the caps on charters.
Right. So, yeah, like you said, I mean, 97% of students in New York State attend real public schools, and then there's only 3% of students that are in charter schools in New York State. Yeah, we see, it's completely disproportionate amount of attention paid from the public sector to lift the cap on charter schools, to do these co-locations. They had a big fight with Mayor de Blasio early in the year about that, which is, again, essentially public money subsidizing these schools who spend a few $1 million on ads to get their co-locations, but at the same time claim that they couldn't afford to pay rent for their own schools. So, I mean, again, it's hard to tell exactly what the vision of these group of billionaires is for the public school system, because they haven't really told us about it. But I think a lot of it goes back to their ideology and kind of like a market-based vision for what schools should look like, right? So it's kind of boiling everything down to high-stakes testing, so you have like a single bottom line that you can use to measure performance instead of having a holistic approach to education with, art, sports, music, counseling. You focus just on testing. And then also this, belief that anything that's outsourced or privatized is going to be automatically better than anything done in the public sector. So trying to outsource teaching and testing to companies like Pearson or like online learning instead of classroom learning. I think their agenda revolves really around this ideology of privatization and favoring market-based approaches to public sector approaches.
And meanwhile, it is starving our public school system. New York State, according to your report, is the seventh from the bottom when it comes to educational equality, and that is largely, I would imagine, driven by the disparate wealth of different communities across New York State, and the fact that these schools are funded by real estate taxes. So give us a sense of just how deep that divide is, and where we stand in terms of the state fulfilling the obligation that the state constitutionally has to education in this state.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the state does have a constitutional obligation to provide free education for all children in the state. And the way that's been interpreted is to have kind of a minimum level of funding and availability of education for all students in the state. And currently the state is about $6 billion short on this constitutional obligation. And then, that's, again, this constitutional obligation is just the minimum, right? It's a floor. It's not an ideal that we should be aspiring to as like the minimum, the goal for how much funding and resources we should be giving for our public schools. This is actually a minimum, and we're $6 billion behind that. And you also see that New York State has the most segregated schools across the country. And a lot of that, racially also ties into socioeconomically segregated schools, where we found a per pupil funding gap of about $8,600 between the wealthiest and the poorest school districts in New York.
Well, I mean, when you talk about the state is $6 billion with a B dollars short on its constitutional obligations to public schools, what does that mean? So, in other words, there are X number of schools in New York State that the courts have found to meet the constitutional obligation of giving everyone a free education that is at a baseline of quality, that it would take $6 billion to bring those people who are below that baseline, those institutions that are below that baseline, up to essentially parity or the minimum, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. And so what's being done? I mean, how long has the state been in arrears? Do we all just know that and then we just sort of walk around and enjoy our day, or what happens?
So there are a number of lawsuits that are currently pending on the state level. In 2006, the State Court of Appeals ruled that New York was failing to meet this obligation, but the state has so far failed to comply with the 2007 agreement that came out of that case. But there's currently two lawsuits pending one of them is scheduled to go on trial in January of next year. And there's a second lawsuit that recently overcame the state's motion to dismiss. So we are seeing some action in the courts to address this lack of funding.
Well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how those courts rule, and what would the resolution be in the event that those courts rule in favor of actually funding our schools to the appropriate level. But anything we're leaving on the table, Mohammad?
Yeah. So I mean, going back to the idea of what the agenda of these folks that are funding this push for charter schools is, I think one thing that's really troubling is the way they kind of use this very blunt instrument of a state senate, a Republican state senate, to fulfill these ends. Right. So if you take them at their word, and what they say is that they believe that education reform is necessary because they really care about the black and brown children of New York State and they want to better their lives. Well, if you look at the agenda of the Republican State Senate, both what they've done in the past 4 years and some of the statements that they've made in the past few weeks, you see that there's an incredibly divergent agenda between the Republican State Senate and anything that would be helpful for students of color. So, for instance, just a couple of weeks ago, after the York Governor ruling, State Senator Marty Golden said that the Republican majority would block any efforts on police reform at the state level. So again, one way to really help low-income students and students of color is to end the school-to-prison pipeline, to end policing in our schools, which should be part of any comprehensive police reform. And that's not going to happen if we have a Republican state Senate. if you look at the DREAM Act, which was stopped by the Republican State Senate in the last session and will likely be held up again, that's something that would help students of color, immigrant students around the state. That's also going to be something that's not going to happen as a result of this spending by these hedge funders.
And how did Andrew Cuomo do in his promise to really campaign hard to make sure the Democrats took over the Senate in New York State?
I mean, I think there's very little evidence that he did anything at all to help the New York State Senate Democrats.
Right, indeed. All right. Well, Mohammad Khan, a senior policy associate with the Washington Park Project. Where can people? Do you guys have a website, or what? How can people get more information? We will link to that report.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
We will link to that report at majority.fm. But if there's other stuff that you're working on, how can we check that out?
So we'll be launching more formally in January of next year. This is just an issue that came up that was really important that we thought we should highlight immediately. But starting in January, you'll see a little more formal launch of the Washington Park Project.
All right, great. Well, we will keep our eyes open for it. Mohammad Khan, thank you so much for joining us today.